Data tells a story. Without it, we are missing context and understanding. A significant portion of the shaping of LGBTQ plus rights and progress started with the interest of governments to not only listen, but also collect information on the people within this demographic. As well, social justice groups had interest in understanding who makes up certain marginalized groups to assess the needs of the population and become a voice on behalf of them. Numerous organizations each year, such as the Human Rights Campaign and Pew Research Center, as well as governments, mainly in the Americas and Europe, have made concerted efforts to survey who are queer people, where they exist, how they have been treated, and what their experiences are. This includes adding questions on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity to large-scale censuses as well as epidemiological datasets to understand health and disease burden. Implications of data collection can have a far-reaching impact. During the initial rise of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, the primary reports of the infectious disease appearing in gay men made it easy to interpret being infected as being due to one's sexuality. As stigmatizing as it sounds, this same rhetoric has been used, as of most recent, to describe the rise of the Mpox virus. Shaming and or being ignorant to the realities of human behavior only serve to further minoritize groups. In health and medicine, there are far too many examples of groups going through a research process for the collection of data on them, only to be taken advantage of, to not receive any benefits of their volunteerism in return, and or become traumatized afterwards. We are still learning from the widespread damage these acts have caused. Although data can be revealing, we should make fair and just interpretations of it. Data on LGBTQ plus people can also be called queer data. We need queer data to understand the lives and experiences of queer people across multiple contexts, including health, workplace, family, economics, entertainment, travel, and more. Recognizing the power that queer data has, Dr. Kevin Guyan, researcher and book author, is here to speak with us today on his passions to influence current data practices and reduce biases in data collection on LGBTQ plus people. Hello, everyone. I am speaking from a new area today. I'm actually home closer to Atlanta, Georgia. But today I'm very, very happy to have another episode of the Queerty Podcast with Dr. Kevin Guyan. Welcome.
Hello.
Yeah, so again, super, super happy that you're here. And let me start with your bio. So Dr. Kevin Guyan is a writer and researcher whose work explores the intersection of data and identity. He is the author of Queer Data, Using Gender, Sex, and Sexuality Data for Action, published by Bloomsbury Academic, which examines the collection, analysis, and use of gender, sex, and sexuality data, particularly as it relates to LGBTQ people in the UK. He is based in Edinburgh, Scotland, and works as a Chancellor Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Kevin is currently writing his second book, which explores queer encounters with different classification systems in the UK, from hate crime reporting to dating apps. And my dog apparently wanted to chime in. But yes, you're welcome. You're welcome. Writing that second book, huh? How's that going?
The end is in sight, getting there. So, final round of edits are ongoing like right now. So speaking with you today is a nice break from me sitting on my own with pen and paper. So I'm really excited. I think it takes some of the ideas from queer data and dials them up 100 times. So hopefully be available tonight and next summer.
That is so, so amazing. I think that building on the work that you've already done probably feels like really nice. Because it's kind of hard, right, to synthesize everything in like one sort of book, I'm sure. I'm sure there's like so many ideas and thoughts like waiting to be expressed, especially in this very, very important topic, obviously, about queer or gender, sex, and sexuality data. So
yeah, with the first book, I kind of wanted just to set the scene. And then with the second book, it's going into a lot more detail about how data practices work in our everyday lives, how we're impacted by them in a range of spaces and places.
Right, exactly. Because there's so many contexts, as you're saying, right, that this whole topic applies to. And thinking about that in terms of what we're going to talk about today, probably going to talk about some health topics too, because when we talk about LGBTQ circumstances, like in terms of living in the world, health tends to be as a context implicated in a lot of the decisions and legislation and activism that occurs. And it's important that we consider how the data is considered in that context too. So I wanted to actually start with, although your research and background does not particularly focus on health outcomes, your work takes place in the context of LGBTQIA plus people living healthy and fulfilling lives. What influenced your interest to investigate these matters in your career?
So a wee bit about my background. I studied history. I did a PhD in history. I was
Mm-hmm,
looking at ideas about gender and architecture and design in London after the Second World War.
mm-hmm,
I then didn't really do much with that research and kind of pivoted
mm-hmm,
somewhat to look more at quantitative data, to look at numbers, stats. And my kind of way into this topic actually was the census in Scotland. So Scotland had the
okay.
last national census in 2022. And really excitingly, that census had new questions on sexual orientation and a question called trans status or history. So Scotland was
Mm-hmm,
among one of the first countries in the world to have these new questions in their census. And for me, kind of analysing, researching, digging it through how those questions were being designed, it became
mm-hmm,
really apparent that the design of questions about sexual orientation, about gender identity, about gender, sex, and sexuality more broadly were extremely political, extremely contested, and could really determine what types of lives and experiences were brought into view. So something like a census counts
mm-hmm,
some LGBTQ people, but it doesn't count everyone. So with my work, I was really keen to kind of expose some of the stuff happening underneath the surface of data collection approaches that we often find, or we often are led to believe, are neutral, apolitical, ahistorical, when actually in reality, they're anything but. How we design and capture data about LGBTQ people is
mm-hmm.
political, historical, and shaped by questions of power.
Right, right. What you made me think. So again, talking about the census, I'm going to get into a particular question about censuses, but that's a huge way for the Scotland government to know their population, right? And it sounds like what you're saying is in that data collection, we like to believe, right, that that collection is like agnostic to politics, that is not thinking about the actual experiences and like feelings of the people you're taking the information from. But again, like it's hard to be neutral. And so it's interesting because you said you started in history. And I'm wondering, like, what about history do you think informs the work that you do then? Is there anything in particular you studied, like within the LGBT rights movement or something like that, that was inspiring for you?
Yeah, I think there's always been a thread in my work. So I do a lot of general equality and diversity work as well. And I think the common thread has been these kind of big questions around gender, sex, sexuality, whether that's in
Mm-hmm,
London in the 1940s, 1950s, or in Edinburgh in the 2020s. That kind of common thread has always been there. But also something really interesting for me is kind of what historical data exists about LGBTQ people. So actually, if we go into the archives,
mm-hmm,
if we look into the records, what type of quantitative or qualitative data is out there?
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
probably
yeah, it's
unsurprisingly,
qualitative.
it's often really bleak. It's really one-sided. It paints often a really negative, narrow vision of these communities' lives and experiences. So, for
Mm-hmm,
example, looking at kind of data on gay men in the UK, most quantitative data is kind of police records around criminality. It's maybe psychological
mm-hmm,
reports on kind of deviance. It's a very
mm-hmm.
one-sided account of this history. So it's interesting to think when these data sets are now being used to kind of train kind of machine learning,
Mm-hmm.
AI technologies. Again, this really
Right.
kind of biased historical data set is going to be shaping our current day as well. So I think there's a real clear link between what happened in the past and what's happening today.
That was so well said. And I agree with you. Like history was one of my favorite subjects. I got to be honest with you in grade school. Like what you just said, like the informing of today, so important to consider, right? Like how is the data collected and like what are we collecting in particular? Like you highlighted like police reports. It has substantial impact, right, on then probably how police are interacting with the community. There's just stuff like that. So I think that that's really awesome. And I want to define the term SOGI, but let me ask you first, do you use that term in your work a lot or like in your writing a lot, like sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or is like there another term like that you'd rather use or describe?
A really good question. I think the term is a bit more North American. I haven't heard it much in the context of UK or Europe. When I do work around my research in the US or Canada, it's all around SOGI data. As a kind of
Okay.
acronym, it's not that common to find in the UK. So I tend to speak about gender, sex, sexuality data, or more specifically, LGBTQ data.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good description to give because again, right, like so people knowing who have listened before, like I work in a North American context. Obviously, I work in like research at Northwestern that we talked a little bit about. And it's interesting how we use different terms to talk about similar issues. But I did want to at least confirm that we are defining the terms. So let's say, so SOGI means sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. But I also wanted to say that we use this term a lot in public health and academia. And then obviously in terms of the UK and other places, gender, sex, and sexual orientation sounds more used from what we just talked about. And so I'm between both of those terms, I'm curious, have you thought about, are we really capturing the basic demographics of our community? Or are we missing other important concepts that should be addressed? And if so, any ideas of what those topics or terms could be? I have a little bit, but I want to see what you got.
A great question. So it's got me thinking about a few things. So maybe first of all, I think whatever work we're doing, whether it's in kind of health, whether it's in kind of historical studies, whether it's stuff around the census, I think it's always going to depend on the type of research questions we're asking. And then we can design our questions to kind of help answer those things we're keen to investigate. So there's never going to be a perfect question. There's never going to be one way of capturing all experiences of all LGBTQ people. It'll depend on the context and discipline of what we're trying to investigate. But even with whether it's acronym SOGI or around gender, sex, and sexuality data, even within those kind of categories, there are so many different dimensions. So if I'm thinking of something like sexuality or sexual orientation, the question that we use in a survey or a research project could be asking about somebody's identity, so maybe how they self-identify. It could be asking about somebody's attractions, so who they're attracted to. It could be asking about behaviors, so we see that in health and science context around kind of MSM, men who have sex with men. These types of questions which are capturing one kind of slice of the community. There's also the question around who we're asking and when. So something like the census in Scotland question on sexual orientation was voluntary, so it wasn't compulsory, which I think is a good thing. But it was only asked of people aged 16 and over. So if you were 15 and living in Scotland, you couldn't share that information about your sexuality. So again, we often kind of devise rules and regulations for who's asked certain questions. Also the medium we use. So if we're asking online, that might attract certain people or it might engage certain communities and not others. And if we're doing an in-person piece of work, that might discourage certain parts of the community who don't want to have that kind of face-to-face interaction. So I think there's a huge number of things around questions, around methods, around the context that really shape the communities brought into view. So my work's really interested in how the kind of all of those decisions I've just flagged, how they bring certain parts of the broader LGBTQ community into light. But at the same time, there's many people who aren't counted for a variety of reasons. And I think we have to keep that part of the community in the light as well and not suggest that this percentage or this quantitative piece of data tells everyone's story, because even with the best methods, the best researchers, we're never going to design something that's perfect.
Right, right, right. And what you're hinting towards for me is like an equitable way of data collection and dissemination as well, like making sure that when we're describing findings that we're also being considerate, like well, this doesn't necessarily represent I mean, in science, you say like the sample population compared to like the general population. Like it doesn't represent necessarily that because there's certain characteristics that a survey might have or a census might have. And there might be certain contexts. Like I think, for example, like differences between like collection of sexual orientation in a US census may have a different context, like in terms of like the making of the question, in terms of like how it's asked compared to a place in the UK. And so I think it's important to consider that. And one of the things that you said that was really important was the multiple dimensions to sexuality, right? Like there's more than just like sexual identity. And I think it's important for people who don't know it already, but there's also the idea of attraction that is separate from identity. And then there's other ways of describing even gender too. Like there's gender identity, but then there's gender expression. And it can get quite sticky.
It can
It's
get
hard
very
to,
sticky. And
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean, with the census in Scotland and the wider UK, the question, which was the real sticking point, was around sex, how a census captures
Mm-hmm.
information on sex. And even
Mm-hmm.
it was really interesting, the Office for National Statistics, which runs the census, identified it was 5 or 6 different ways of conceptualizing sex in the census. So you could have legal sex, you could have biological sex, you could have
Mm-hmm.
self-identified sex. So again, something that many people think is a really clear binary variable, again, in reality, is really messy and really complex and really nuanced. So I think what I'm really hoping with my
Right.
work and my writing is I get the message out there that it's messy, it's not kind of clear cut, it's context specific. And rather than avoiding that, just leaning into it, embracing it, engaging it, exploring it, untangling it. I think that's why it's a really exciting topic.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Very, very interesting. And I want to get into now, like you have brought up this book, and like I wanted to tell people the name of this book. Or actually, I'll let you tell it because it is yours. And then after that, I'll give my little spill. So can you give us the name of it? Your first one?
Yeah, so the plug, I don't have a physical copy to kind of brand in front, but it's called Queer Data Using Gender, Sex and Sexuality Data for Action. And it came out in 2022 with Bloomsbury Academic. It's fairly easy to grab a copy in the US, in Canada, Europe. It's not a crazy price. Also, it's kind of it's an academic book, but it's written for an engaging, accessible audience. I did not write this for kind of academic talk. It's written for people who are keen to learn more about gender, sex, sexuality data, to think critically
Awesome.
about its benefits, its opportunities, also the risks and the dangers that come through collecting
Mhm.
more data about gender, sex, and sexuality. It's very much pitched in the context of what's been happening in the UK. But I think these lessons and these stories are super relevant to every part of the world, which is having these similar discussions and kind of explorations about how we capture data on LGBTQ communities.
Incredible. Thank you for that description. Yes, I've already recommended it to some people, but it's definitely on my list. I'm an avid reader, so I need to put it on my list. But thank you so much for giving that explanation. So let's talk about censuses. Census data of the people living in a country is generally the most common way we understand the country's demographic makeup. Certain countries, and in particular England and Scotland, where you are, have decided to add questions on gender, sex, and sexual orientation to their census questionnaire. The findings, while helpful, also have important implications that we can consider. As well, censuses sometimes may not be the best ways of collecting information, as it can be in the wrong hands, stigmatizing or used against people. So I'm curious, will collection of this data in censuses overall benefit LGBTQ people across multiple domains if we keep adding these questions to censuses across different countries? Or are there some drawbacks for collecting this information that should be considered?
So I'm going to do a really kind of middle of the road yes and no answer. I'll start with positives. There are lots of positives in asking new questions in a census on sexual orientation and gender identity. I think in terms of kind of the research and policy that this can help, it can help pinpoint where services need to go, where kind of additional funding or resources need to be targeted. But also, I think at a human level, it's a really meaningful thing to be counted in something like a state data collection exercise. It's really meaningful, again, with my kind of historian's hat on, to think that in 100 years' time, somebody's going to open up my census file and see kind of me describing myself as a gay man living in Edinburgh. There's something really meaningful about that, kind of seeing yourself reflected in a data collection exercise. So there's definitely positives, but there's also some risks and dangers. And I think we speak a lot about the positives, but we don't sometimes speak enough about the dangers that come with being counted. And just to kind of touch on maybe a couple of them. So one is around kind of what the data tells us in the end. So the results from Scotland's census were published in June this year, and we now know that 4% of Scotland's population identify as LGBT+, and 0.4% of the population identify as trans. Those figures kind of reflect what people thought maybe beforehand. It wasn't much higher or lower than people's assumptions about the size of the population. But there is a risk if that number was actually really small, that would have weaponized opponents of LGBTQ rights to say, why are these services, these groups receiving government money, funding, attention, if they only count for 1% of the population, for example? So there is a sense that kind of quantitative data, census data, is seen as this kind of gold standard. And there is a risk that if that data doesn't represent or reflect the community, it can be kind of weaponized in ways that does a lot of harm and damage to the communities being counted. So I've been speaking about LGBTQ communities, but these are similar dangers for any kind of marginalized or minoritized group that's brought into a national data collection exercise. I think a second risk, I'm not going to say too much doom and gloom, but I'll just pick out one more risk, and that's around how this data is going to be kind of kept and used in the future. So in the UK, census data is kept locked away for 100 years, kind of individual records, they're not accessible for 100 years. But I don't know the political direction of the UK, Europe, the rest of the world, and say in 15, 20 years' time, we're run by a fascist dictatorship who has this data set of every trans person in Scotland. This could be an extremely dangerous piece of data that could be really misused in a variety of terrifying ways. So I think keeping that risk in mind, I think is really important. I think anybody engaging in any data collection project or research needs to kind of weigh up the pros and the cons before they share data about themselves, both now, but also in the kind of medium to longer future where we don't know how this data will be used. So I think that's a balancing act. I think there's benefits, there's risks, there's dangers. And I think kind of just sharing that and a greater awareness of it, I think is really key.
Right. Thank you so much. I think we could go on this topic, goodness, for like more than an hour, because it's really, again, like I use the word sticky, but it's really multifaceted in terms of the implications of the data. But one thing that you said that was striking to me about the looking back in 100 years and understanding, like somebody probably may particularly be understanding like, oh, like what did the population look like around this time? Oh, like somebody maybe in your family tree might be interested to see, oh, or somebody else's family tree, for example. And did I have any queer people in my family tree? Like things like that. There's some beauty in the representation, but also again, in the wrong hands and used for the wrong context could be discriminatory, and makes me think too of like the historical practices of collection of either African American or Native American identity in the US, like in the 1800s and 1900s, like early 1900s, and how that data was used in a quite poorly and subjecting the people to racism and discrimination, and understanding like how we can learn from that, like how we can learn from different practices across the world that use that in a wrong way. Obviously thinking, and I want to stress this because it's so important. I think a huge part of why this book means a lot in today's context is that many places across the world do not currently consider collection of gender, sex, and sexual orientation as either relevant to the progress of like their nation, or rather looks down upon it as a part of society that should be kept away and stigmatized. And when we encourage that data collection and when we lessen the stigma, there can be more consideration for provision of social services to this population. There could be more consideration of how we are delivering messaging in terms of media, or like how are we represented in terms of overall just different contexts of like work or housing or any other context. And it can make it a goal for administrations to say, hey, we need to do more with this population, given that LGBTQ people are so marginalized. And like one more point, which I think you kind of hinted on a little bit earlier, was that it can be almost a sort of outing too if people whose gender identity or sexual orientation on a census is revealed without their, I guess, permission, or with them not necessarily wanting that to be revealed. And so I guess some people may also not want to participate because of that if they're worried. Would you agree?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe a census isn't the best example for that, but maybe something like a diversity monitoring form by your work, your employer, when you're asked to share equality
Sure.
monitoring information to HR. I think that's a really common place where increasingly we're asked information about sexuality, about disability, race, gender, whether our kind of gender identity. And I think in those situations, there are risks around particularly this move towards kind of intersectional approaches to data. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's positive, but with intersectionality also comes a challenge with small numbers, where actually if we're analysing our workforce by sexuality and race and gender, actually once we've kind of spliced it three ways, we
Mm-hmm.
might be speaking about 4 or 5 colleagues, and then it becomes quite risky to kind of share this data because we might then be outing kind of colleagues, we might be disclosing information about their characteristics that they didn't want to share. So I think, again, something like kind of disaggregated data, intersectional approaches to data, they're
Mm-hmm.
definitely well intentioned and there's good intentions. But with that, there is also, I guess, more risks about kind of small numbers. And as you've highlighted, the risk of outing people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And thank you for clarifying about at workplace, like that example could be more relevant. Certainly, work context definitely would like to sometimes get all that information about their constituents, but it depends on what the person, how the person would like to express that or like say that about themselves right now. And yeah, that's very important to clarify. So I also read an article published in the Independent that you were, I think you wrote. It seemed like you had written the article, and there was a quote at the end, and I'm gonna read it. And what was written was, being counted is sometimes an important step on a bigger journey, but in isolation, data does nothing to change the world when it's not followed by action. And using information from large scale surveys and population based metrics to gauge services provided to the community, we also do require action. And sometimes this can take place in terms of enaction of laws that allow the provision of services and enforcement from the executive powers that be. So I'm curious, did referencing laws and enforcement become a part of the action that you were talking about? Or were there other steps in terms of acting upon the data that you were referencing?
Oh, I really like that question. I think I was thinking of action in a very broad sense. So
Mm-hmm.
what has really been a massive annoyance for me over the past 5, 10 years is when data projects just become obsessed with collecting more and more and more data about marginalized communities. So I've done
Mm-hmm.
quite a lot of work in the higher education sector, in universities and colleges in the UK. And there's been a lot of activity, a lot of projects to gather data about the experiences of LGBTQ students, staff, bullying, harassment, employment opportunities, just an amassing of more and more quantitative and qualitative data. But for
Mm-hmm.
me, that doesn't do anything if it's not being used to actually address the problems being investigated. You could have the most comprehensive data set on LGBTQ experiences, but
Mm-hmm.
actually the findings from that data set aren't being used to change policies, to change law, to change on the ground material conditions of people's
Right.
lives, then that kind of data collection is meaningless in many ways. So for me, I think it's always got to run in tandem. The data collection, the data analysis has to be followed by action. We spend a
Mm-hmm.
lot of time gathering data, amassing data, and I think sometimes in some institutions and organizations, they lose sight of why they're collecting the data. It's quite a nice item on an action list or an agenda item or something that a group or an organization will think, if we just collect more and more data about LGBTQ experiences, then somehow that will magically transform people's day-to-day realities. And that's not the
Mm-hmm.
case. So what I hope a clear message from the book, and it's kind of the subtitle of the book as well, is kind of using data for action, is that we have to ensure that whenever we're gathering data, it's kind of used meaningfully to change the world around us. And I think also
Mm-hmm.
just being savvy to how some institutions and some organizations, whether it's governments or universities or businesses, how actually they can sometimes use data collection as a stalling technique. So a way of actually not doing anything to address the problem. So if you
Right.
have a problem with transphobic bullying in your organization, collecting data about the problem is far easier than addressing the problem of transphobic bullying. So again, just being savvy to how some institutions kind of use data as a way to evade or kind of escape addressing the
Mm-hmm.
situation. And I think that is how data can be misused when it's kind of
Yeah.
stalling real world actions.
Yeah, my goodness. The bullying conversation is quite relevant, particularly in LGBT youth in school. I'm thinking about, goodness gracious, I'm thinking about how there's so many people who are going through like active discrimination, but yet like are having data collected on them to say like it exists. Like we know it exists.
Yeah.
I think it's quite clear that it's happening and that it's happening across different contexts. But like, what are we actually doing to prevent this from even occurring or like stop it from happening like right now? And again, I think that another part of this whole conversation also involves involving people from the community, like in the actual question making and actually in the dissemination of the data and like people to say like, okay, like what is the call to action? So let me actually begin this way. So collection of data on LGBTQ plus people has particular importance in healthcare delivery, quality, and research. For example, cancer registries that collect demographics on people affected by cancer have historically lacked data in sex, sexual orientation, gender identity. This is similar for other public health data centers that track and understand cardiovascular health, infectious diseases such as HIV, and more. Helping with these efforts, though, involves hearing back from the community themselves on what they think should be considered. So if we're doing some sort of epi study, like epidemiological study on HIV risk, how is that informed by people actually living with HIV, like the men, women, non-binary people, everyone who's affected by this? And so I wanted to ask you, how often are voices from the community itself considered in the queer data collection efforts that you've been aware of, and has not doing this backfired?
Again, I can't speak on every example, but I think in my own work, things are maybe getting better. I think people are more aware of the importance of bringing people with lived experience into the room where decisions are made about
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ data or data collection practices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the census was quite a bad example of that, but I think there are
Mm.
learnings in terms of ensuring that you're not going to be able to develop questions or tools or methods if you're speaking in a bubble where you haven't got that kind of diversity of voices in the space. But I think there's
Right.
also a tension in this work as well around
Mm-hmm.
people's kind of labour and work and the expectations of people in marginalised and minoritized communities to
Mm-hmm.
always be involved in designing LGBTQ surveys or forms or research projects. We can't be expecting people who often are quite a numerically small group to be spending a lot of their time providing feedback, consultation, input into every single decision being made. So in my work, I argue that we need to kind of create decision-making spaces that can embrace both lived experience, but also people who have
Yes.
competency and expertise of the topic. So they might not directly have that lived experience, but they have the knowledge and the kind of the context to be able to help make decisions in that
Right.
space. So that's kind of where I've landed in terms of, should it only be LGBTQ people who are designing questions around the LGBTQ population? I don't think that should be the case, but I think those in the room need to have the competency to know the limits of their knowledge and to go, actually, I'm going to take a step back and give my seat at the table to somebody who has lived experience and the expertise and is far better placed to make a call on the response options to this question or the wording for this question. So I think we need to always think about the kind of labor demands and the kind of emotional, the expectations we're placing on people who are in workplaces, in health contexts, are often being pulled in multiple ways to be involved in many other diversity, equality, and inclusion projects.
Yes, yes. There can be a playing field, there can be a decision making room where both sides are sort of represented, right? Obviously, we need those experts in the actual SOGI matters or the gender, sex, sexual orientation matters and the actual data collection. But we also need people, right, coming in who say, like, I live with this disease. I live in this circumstance, like, or I came from a background where I was unhoused, or I was participating in sex work, or I was using drugs. Obviously, very sensitive topics. However, if you involve people and you ask them first, like, is this okay that we're asking it this way? How would you read this if you were taking this survey? Or how would you want to know about these results if you found out that we did this study? I think it makes it even more rich in terms of the implications of what we can take from it. And obviously, the community wants to be more than likely a part of something that has their name on it and essentially has a huge impact on how they're perceived. And I think, yeah, from what you said, we kind of need both. We kind of need people who come from both sides. So thank you for that. Alrighty. So I kind of think I'll go to this one. In a variety of sectors, LGBTQ people may experience more discrimination or stigma in the workplace or in getting a home or in achieving a higher education even. And when we talk about a collection of data, again, like another tie-in to that conversation about not using that in isolation is also making sure that we're discussing it in terms of the context of like queer people's circumstances. And so I'm curious, how are we considering that topic of like intersectionality in terms of the data collection of SOGI data? Like, are there any reports that you've seen that have kind of, for example, like you gave some statistical evidence on what the current percentages of LGBT identification are in Scotland. But I'm curious, has anyone been curious about breaking that down in terms of like the different class groups in Scotland or like the different levels of education that people might have, example, etc.?
Yeah, it will come, so not in the context of Scotland quite yet. Some of that data has been published for England and Wales, and it will be published for Scotland. And I think it'll be fascinating to see, as you're saying, the breakdown of sexual orientation by race, ethnicity, by disability, by rural, urban, all of these kind of splits, to kind of just make sense and kind of get that picture of the population across with different identity markers and intersections. I think that'll be really rich, add a kind of richness to the data, and it's going to be key to kind of any future work to get a kind of sense of the kind of demographic picture with that data. But also, I think we've been speaking a lot about gender, sex, sexuality data. These kind of methodological, conceptual problems are there for other identity groups as well. So again, on the collection of data around race or ethnicity, the risk of undercounting certain populations who might not wish to engage with the census for a variety of reasons. I've done quite a lot of work of late around hate crime data in Scotland and the UK. And again, the kind of experience and the relationship between the police and racialized communities, again, will probably have an impact on the type of hate crime data on LGBTQ people that's captured it might overrepresent people who are white and LGBTQ and underrepresent kind of communities of color who are queer. So again, that
Mhm.
kind of untangling, I think, is there. And again, it's a product of history, it's a product of politics and power, and how we relate to different institutions, different data collection agencies will all kind of shape the outcomes of the data that we're looking at. So I think this is a far bigger picture, and I think it's impossible to
Yeah.
look at one thing in isolation. And in the context of the UK, it's been quite challenging because we have something called the Equality Act, which is a high level piece of equalities legislation that was introduced in 2010. And in this
Hmm.
act, there is 9 protected characteristics. But this has kind of shaped how we think about data and data variables, that we kind of
Hmm.
always silo and have these 9 distinct characteristics. But actually, as we've been speaking about, in life, it's far messier. There's a lot of overlap. We don't exist as 9 characteristics. We exist as a bundle of life and experiences. So again, the kind of legislation that determines how data is collected can kind of entrench
Mm,
and embed certain ways of thinking about data that don't necessarily reflect people's experiences.
mm. Certainly. And getting to that part about the legislation and laws, those are so dictative of what can be said and what is protected versus what is not. And it can be tricky too, because in certain places, sex and sexual orientation, gender identity are sometimes confabulated, but also put in this label of like, well, sex is a protected characteristic. Like in terms of the US here, like on the equal employment, I think it's called like the EEO ordinance. You can't hire anyone or fire anyone, particularly based on certain protected characteristics. And like one of those would involve sex. So in terms of that conversation, it can be brought up that, well, LGBT people need to fall under that because when we're talking about sex and gender and sexual orientation, there's some overlap there in terms of some people might be discriminated against it. However, we still want to be mindful that those are not all the same thing. However, it can be tricky because certain countries don't necessarily have those protections like explicitly for those categories. And so somebody might sue and then be like, oh, well, I should be protected because it's here. It says, you can't discriminate kids on sex and gender. Regardless of all of that, there could be some pushback in terms of laws or policies that are passed. And I had a prior conversation on the podcast with guest Anna Jane Metcalf, who has a website named tdoor.translivesmatter.info that publishes information on the deaths of suspected LGBTQ person deaths in the community. Reports of homophobic or transphobic related deaths can result in significant backlash and unrest among queer and allied communities alike. I am curious, now that we've talked a little bit about like that Equality Act, how does activism and pushback from the community also influence changes in the laws of countries, next to understanding these reports on the data that we know?
Oh, a very rich question. So I'm going
Have
to
you
just pick
seen
out one
any?
bit of it.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
have. Yeah, I'm going to pick out one bit. I'm going to just speak to the bit around kind of when the community push back or are able to kind of bring up new ideas or new challenges. And I think maybe one element of that is I'm interested in how spaces in data collection projects, research, health censuses, kind of create spaces for people to subvert the data collection tool or refuse to participate. I'm interested in how those kind of decisions are not treated as just simply people being indifferent or not bothered or being problematic, but actually people's decision to refuse to participate is actually
Hmm.
recognized as a valid decision. Actually,
Yeah.
you don't have to participate if you don't want to. And I think in research projects and kind of health projects, there's this awful tendency to assume that kind of informed consent, or if we can just kind of pitch a project in the right way, people will come on board and give us their
Hmm.
information. This very like extractivist view of data. But actually, what if we flipped it and imagined like why do they have to give their data? Why do they have to disclose this information to us? And I think when we
Mm.
speak about trying to kind of target kind of minoritized groups or kind of communities, which is a horrible phrase, are often described as kind of hard to reach. we're often
Mm-hmm.
assuming that we're just approaching it the wrong way, or we just provide more information or more insight. These communities will disclose information to these researchers. But actually, I think we need to really embrace that they might not want to. And I think that is a valid position, a valid political position. So
Yeah.
really creating spaces for communities to refuse to participate. And importantly, whether it's in healthcare or social services, not being disadvantaged for that. So if you don't want to
Yeah.
share your sexual orientation with your housing provider or your school or your university, there's going to be no negative fallout from that. And I think that's really important, that people can refuse and aren't going to be
Mm-hmm.
disadvantaged for not sharing data about who they are.
For sure. For sure. Frankly, some people may just say it's none of your business. Like they
Exactly. And
just they
that's a
yeah.
really important position. Yeah.
Yeah, some people may say it's none of your business. Also, like just thinking about generational context, I think that the younger generation might be more willing to talk about it compared to older generations, just because of historically like what has happened and like what we can consider as bad practices that have been used against people, particularly who are identified as LGBT, like over 100 years ago. And so that consideration also matters. And regardless of how the data is being collected or like where it's presented, there will always be commentary and consciousness that is raised around an issue, and people will be having to say something. But I think what really matters is, again, having those voices from the community involved in some capacity and realizing that there should be almost like an expectation that people are going to have a response to major changes, like major laws that are enacted, and understanding like what are those voices and like where are they coming from, and responding appropriately to that. Because again, when we talk about making more equitable data collection and interpretation and dissemination, like thinking on the response to that and how does the activism actually influence that change? I think that's why this question is so important. So it's hard to have one without the other. And I think you maybe agree. So, okay.
I do.
Alrighty. Thank you so much. This has been great. I kept you on for longer than anticipated. I only have one more question, if that's okay. So, the social inequities that we've discussed today don't disappear overnight, but raising consciousness and voicing the changes that we do need can gradually get us there. You're writing your second book. Currently, I'm trying to do research in this area, but also I'm trying to understand with the podcast, right? Other ways that I can be sort of a voice and sort of a way of getting queer voices and queer experiences out there for people to understand. So, what else is on your agenda? Is I have things that I want to do in the future, but I'm sure there's some other things that you're doing. So, beyond just writing the new book, anything else that you have planned?
Yeah, so I can give maybe a small teaser of things to come. So the book
Okay.
is going to be a collection of ideas, but kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about collecting data needs to
Yeah.
turn into action. So very much using the book as a platform for action. And what I'm hoping to
Mm-hmm.
do with the next book is find opportunities to engage particularly people working in industry. So people who are working for businesses, for healthcare providers, for organizations, to kind of translate some of these ideas that have been kind of a bit overly academic, maybe in the past, translating those
Yeah.
ideas into everyday practices. So I'm really interested in how we kind of communicate across different sectors and industries. So what I'm hoping to do with the book is it looks across 6 different sectors in industry. So it looks at police, it looks at healthcare, it looks at business, it looks at arts. Actually, all these industries are having conversations about gender, sex, sexuality data, but they're often not joined up or not aware that these conversations are taking place. So I'm really keen to think through how do we kind of join the dots between people working in different spaces, different places, people who are academics, people who are researchers, activists, artists, practitioners. How do we bring together this kind of mass of people engaged in queer data, LGBTQ data, and start to kind of develop almost a movement around this work that can change practices more broadly. So for me, there's no point doing this work if it's just sitting in academic journals or kind of academic spaces, the whole point of doing it is to kind of change the world around us and kind of reshape how we think about data practices and how they affect different marginalized communities.
Yay! The involving people in the industry in the workplace, I think that's a great idea. And again, it's so grounding for people understanding the work you do, right? In terms of interacting and engaging their thoughts and engaging their experiences. A huge part of health, right? It also involves where you work and like what are the contexts in which you work and like are you supported in that? And so that's so, so important to investigate and to engage people in. So I'm very, very excited. I'm looking forward to reading about your work, and I think that this has been really awesome. I'm so sorry that my dog has been so loud, but I think I'm about to take him out because I think he has to go to the bathroom. Anyway, anything else you wanted to add before we
No,
end?
it's just been lovely to chat. The time has flown by. It's been really great to learn more about your work and your questions, and you just really ask questions that really get to the heart of the matter. So yeah, it was great to speak.
Thank you so much, Kevin. You've been amazing. I'm going to end the recording now. I am so happy Kevin came on to remind us of a few things. One, data collection and reporting is only half the job. What must follow is action. Two, intersectionality tells us that there are multiple aspects of a person's identity that may influence what data is collected and how it is used in service to them or against them. Three, as more groups take an interest in understanding the lived experiences of queer people, qualitative data is increasingly more needed next to quantitative, so we have an appropriate balance of perspectives. Now, how does interacting with queer data affect you? I think we all have a responsibility to share information responsibly and refrain from speculation and misinformation. As a marginalized group in society, LGBTQ plus people should be able to speak for themselves first and give input into what's collected on them. If you don't know enough of a topic but have information about it, learn about it. It's not enough to ask people of that experience. It's even better to read, listen, or pay attention, and then come into the conversation, open to questions and or changing your perspective. Data tells a story, but it doesn't mean that's everyone's reality, and we must acknowledge that. Then we can realize the benefits and pitfalls of data to inform how we proceed with its interpretation and future collection down the line. Thank you for listening in and or watching. If you would like to read more about Kevin's involvement, visit his website at kevinguyan.com, KEVINGUYAN.com, or grab a book of queer data using gender, sex, and sexuality data for action at bookstores and libraries now. You can find references for our conversation in this episode's biography. If you want to hear more content, watch clips of our conversation and more, let's continue to push the conversation more on Instagram at Equality Podcast, Twitter at Equality Pod, or on TikTok at BEQ Pod. If you like what you heard today, please give a quick star rating on your preferred listening platform and definitely subscribe if you're on the YouTube. Take care and see you in the next episode.